Terrorists attack the heart of America. Hijacked planes smash into New York's tallest buildings. The World Trade Center collapses with thousands of people trapped inside. Another airliner then flew into the Pentagon. The White House says those who carried out the attacks will be hunted down.
I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbored them.
This is BBC News. I'm Deborah Mackenzie.
And I'm Bill Turnbull. Thousands of people are feared dead after a devastating series of terrorist attacks on the United States of America. At around 9 a.m. local time, hijacked passenger aircraft were flown deliberately into the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. Within the next 2 hours, the center of Manhattan's business area lay in ruins after the twin towers of the Trade Center, America's two tallest buildings, collapsed. All air traffic in the country was suspended and security forces put onto a state of the highest alert. President Bush, who'd been visiting Florida, was evacuated to a nuclear bunker from where he pledged to hunt down and punish those responsible. The first blow was struck at 8:45 in the morning, New York time. A hijacked airliner carrying dozens of passengers flew straight into the World Trade Center's North Tower with devastating effect. 18 minutes later, a second attack. Another hijacked jet struck the Trade Center's twin South Tower, exploding in a huge fireball. Next, it was the turn of Washington and the Pentagon, the nerve center of America's military. A third hijacked American airliner, again with dozens of passengers on board, deliberately flown into the side of the building. As panic spread on the streets, all civilian flights were grounded. New York's stock exchange was suspended and the White House was evacuated, along with thousands of personnel in other government buildings. Then the unthinkable. The South Tower of the World Trade Center, the world's fourth tallest building, collapsed. Followed minutes later by the center's second tower, the building symbol of global trade and workplace for 50,000 people, reduced to rubble. No one knows how many have died. A fourth hijacked plane crashed later in Pennsylvania. For the latest, let's go to Washington and join our correspondent Stephen Sfeach. Stephen, President Bush talking in terms of thousands of people dead. We believe as many as 200 firefighters may have been killed in New York alone. What word from the Pentagon?
Well, I have some rather shocking news for you, Bill. It's been reported on NBC News here. They're quoting firefighters around the Pentagon as saying there may be as many as 800 people dead in the Pentagon. Now that's 800 inside one part of the Pentagon building. That's in addition to 266 people we believe to have been killed on board the 4 airliners that crashed during the course of Tuesday, as more than 250 firefighters missing in New York and more than 80 policemen. So we're already talking, we're already talking more than 1,000 people, plus we believe possibly thousands more at the World Trade Center for the people who were in there. And for this report on the day's events, over to my colleague, James Robbins.
It should have been a perfect day. But just before 9 o'clock, the pure blue sky over Manhattan was filling with smoke. A hijacked American airliner had just smashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. No one quite knew what had happened. Surely this must have been a terrible accident. But what happened next showed these were no accidents. A second hijacked airliner, a Boeing 767 with 92 people on board, is flying straight for the other tower. No one yet knows who piloted these planes to destruction, but they could not have been targeted with greater accuracy. The extraordinary impact of the second plane, the 767, was witnessed by many who simply didn't realize the full enormity of what was happening. Nor could they know the implications of a huge airliner laden with aviation fuel exploding deep inside one of the world's tallest buildings. They certainly didn't realize the twin towers of the World Trade Center were now completely doomed.
Wow, You see this aircraft? I've got it all.
By now, many hundreds of people must already have been dead, and the unfolding disaster could be seen all around New York.
Another one. I'm taking a look. Oh my God! Oh, Jesus! Oh my God! My own eye. Just went in. Must be a car or something. Oh my God! Another plane just went in.
At that time, there would have been about 10,000 people in each tower of the World Trade Center, many thousands more in the Wall Street financial district all around. Those who could were running for their lives.
Let's just...
I was just standing here watching the World Trade Center after the first plane hit. I just saw a second plane come in from the south and hit the South Tower halfway between the bottom and the top of the tower. It's got to be a terrorist attack. I can't tell you anything more than that. I saw the plane hit the building.
When a big explosion happened, some guy came out, his skin was all off. I helped him out. This is him all over. There's people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows. It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
We heard a big bang, and then we saw smoke coming out, and everybody started running out, and we saw the plane on the other side of the building, and there was smoke everywhere, and people are jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out the windows, I guess because they're trying to save themselves. I don't know.
But it wasn't only New York and America's financial heart which was under attack. Now it was the nation's capital, too. In Washington, the Pentagon was hit, headquarters for the armed forces of the world's superpower. A third hijacked airliner, again with dozens on board, had been crashed with devastating results. By now, smoke was billowing around Capitol Hill, and the White House was being evacuated. People were talking of a new Pearl Harbor, someone declaring war on the United States. And back in New York, the nightmare was still far from over. Firefighters were in the basement of the World Trade Center, wondering if the building above was safe. The unthinkable was about to happen. The South Tower, all 110 stories, collapsed, and it was all live on American television.
Thanks very much,
completely collapsed.
The whole side has collapsed?
The whole building has collapsed.
The whole building has collapsed?
The building has collapsed.
That's the southern tower you're talking about?
Exactly. The second building that we witnessed the airplane enter.
On the ground, emergency services hardly knew which way to turn. People still trapped in the second tower had seen it all and could only wave in desperation. But it was already too late for rescue. The second tower, representing America's trade and wealth, was about to go. The Twin Towers, which took 7 years to build, had been utterly destroyed in a single morning. The Manhattan skyline and countless lives devastated.
Not go down on the ground. You will get trapped. You will get trapped. Don't go.
Big boom. Come down the steps. Everything fine till we got to the basement, and then everything just fell in. I got trapped under there with another guy. Crawled out. Kept getting hit in the head. Bags rolled around. Finally, we clawed our way out over the rubble.
Yeah.
Come on down. We did all right.
All right, way to be, Tom. Let's go.
Even the bloodied felt incredibly lucky on this terrible day. And firefighters could embrace each other for a few moments before facing many more hours of trauma. As New York struggled to cope, to adapt to the clogging dust, the fallout of so much tragedy, More news was coming in, a fourth crashed airliner in Pittsburgh. And somehow American government seemed almost powerless amidst all this. The centers of that power had been evacuated, key congressional leaders taken to secret locations. The president himself whisked to a nuclear bunker in Nebraska, shaken but pledging somehow to find those who masterminded this day of mayhem and massacre.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended. I want to reassure the American people that the full resources of the federal government are working to assist local authorities to save lives and to help the victims of these attacks. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
Hours after the attacks, the United States, the whole world, is struggling to take it all in. There's really no more rescue the firemen can seriously attempt. It's now a question of salvage amid the wreckage, as others in New York try to establish how many men, women and children have been lost. A priest picks his way through the New York ruins. The World Trade Center has been reduced to the stumps of skyscrapers that once helped define one of the world's most vibrant cities, normally loud with life. An entire society feels itself violated by terror. James Robbins, BBC News.
Well, Stephen's feature still with us in Washington. Stephen, President Bush vowing to find those responsible. How on earth do they begin to look?
Well, there are already certainly some suspicions among intelligence officials here. Senator Orrin Hatch, who's a Republican senator, has quoted CIA sources as saying that they are beginning to believe that this was the work of Osama bin Laden and his group. And we've also had other reports that intelligence officials are hardening their suspicions on Osama bin Laden. I mean, that is a start, if that's what they believe. But of course, the investigation is going to go on for several days. And I think if they're wise, the administration of the government will take their time before they come out with any public statements blaming anybody. President Bush was notably cautious in what he said a few hours ago. What he did say, of course, was that there would be the same strong measures taken against those who harbour terrorists as against those who carry out the attacks. So perhaps a hint there of who they believe might have been responsible.
Any indications yet as to how the hijackers managed to take control of the aircraft?
According to the Attorney General, John Ashcroft, and indeed according to other reports that we'd already had, it was done with knives. It would have been much harder to smuggle guns on board the 4 aircraft that were hijacked. So it seems that they managed somehow to get knives on board, and they then apparently stabbed some of the flight personnel. This is according to mobile phone calls that were made by passengers who were unfortunate enough to be on the planes. And that was how they managed to get control of the aircraft, which they then flew into the various targets.
And just to reiterate, Stephen, the casualty figures, the casualty estimates we're getting so far sound pretty horrific.
Absolutely. We're talking in New York about possibly thousands of people. That number is still completely unclear, people who were killed within the World Trade Center itself. The New York Fire Force are talking about more than 260 firefighters missing. The police department saying more than 80 police missing, feared dead. 266 people on board the 4 planes. And the latest figure, and one which I think has surprised us here, 800 people believed dead, according to firefighters, inside the Pentagon.
People will be asking, given that this doomsday scenario, if you like, on the terrorist front has been around for a while, people will be asking how on earth security was so lax that it could take place, and how on earth American intelligence failed to see it coming.
Yes, I think there are those 2 angles. One is the immediate question of how the attack took place on US soil. First of all, how the hijackers managed to get knives on board planes. I think there's a lot of questions being asked about the hijacks. Then the question of how the planes were able to hit their targets. I think a little bit more understanding of that to a certain extent, given that there apparently was no knowledge of that this was going to happen. The fact that you have civilian airliners flying low over New York, that is a pretty hard thing to prevent. And indeed, there are questions as to whether it would have been within the law to shoot down those civilian airliners, even had the authorities known where they were heading. But I think the big question, you have to take the whole thing further back in time, is about US intelligence not knowing that this thing was going to happen. And indeed, some people are saying that really the US government that should have gone after the people who were going to be plotting this kind of thing a long time ago.
Stephen Speech in Washington, thank you very much.
This is BBC News, a summary now of the main news. President George Bush has acknowledged that thousands of people were killed in the series of attacks in which hijacked airliners were flown deliberately into landmark buildings on Tuesday. Speaking from the White House, President Bush said the victims' lives had been ended by evil. He said world leaders would stand together to win the war against terrorism.
It's a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world.
He was speaking after consulting his national security advisors about how to respond to the destruction of the World Trade Center in New York and serious damage to the Pentagon in Washington. The two hijacked passenger planes flew directly into the sides of the twin skyscrapers of the World Trade Center during Tuesday morning's rush hour. Both towers caught fire immediately and later collapsed, sending clouds of dust and billowing smoke into Manhattan as people frantically tried to escape.
The police officer told everybody to form a human chain, and we held on to each other, and he flashed the light, and he directed us to Building 5, and we went out Building 5.
Did you see people bleeding, and what did you see?
Oh, everybody could see. You want blood? Here's blood. Everybody's bleeding. People are laying all over the floor. It's horrible. And I was there the first time, and this is twice.
Shortly after the first two strikes, another hijacked Boeing passenger plane crashed near the Pentagon building in Washington, the headquarters of the American military. The building burst into flames and part of its five-sided structure collapsed. A fourth airliner crashed in Pennsylvania, again after apparently being hijacked. More than 12 hours after the attacks began, the full scale of the loss of life is not known. Nearly 270 people are known to have died in the four hijacked aircraft, and union officials in New York say several hundreds firefighters and policemen disappeared. Many of them are believed dead. In the last few hours, New York's Mayor, Rudolph Giuliani, advised New Yorkers to stay away from the city center if at all possible.
It's important and it's critical, then you come to work. But if you can stay home tomorrow, you're going to make things easier on yourself and easier on the city if you stay home. So the city is not officially closed. Manhattan is not officially closed north of 14th Street. But we're advising people if you can stay home, it would be better. Outside of Manhattan, you go to work and do all the things you would normally do. There's no particular reason to be constricted in activities there. But if you can stay out of the city, that would be good.
International leaders around the world have condemned the attacks, among them the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat and the Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon.
I believe that together we can defeat these forces of evil. At this most difficult hour, all Israelis stand as one with the American people.
First of all, I am offering my condolences, the condolences of the Palestinian people to the American President, President Bush, to his government, to the American people for this terrible act. We are completely shocked, completely shocked.
Meanwhile, American forces around the world have been placed on the highest alert and warships have been deployed along the US East Coast. Suspicion has fallen on Islamic militant groups, including those associated with the Saudi exile Osama bin Laden, already wanted by the Americans. The Taliban authorities in Afghanistan, where Mr. bin Laden is based, say he didn't have the capability for such a huge operation. Many world governments have also ordered defense alerts and called emergency security meetings.
Right across the United States, people have been watching in horror the events unfolding in New York, Washington and Pennsylvania. Joining us now live from Portland, Oregon is our correspondent Nick Bryant. Nick, you're on entirely the other side of the country from the scene of these ghastly events. What are people saying there?
Bill, people are looking at these pictures and they still can't believe what they're seeing. People are making the comparison, as you say, with Pearl Harbor, the attack in 1941, which killed about 2,600 people. But this is much, much worse, it seems. And the thing is that people didn't watch Pearl Harbor unfold before their eyes on national television. And that's what happened today. From very early in the morning here on the West Coast, people were gathering around televisions and watching in utter disbelief at the scenes that they were seeing, first of all in New York and then in Washington, D.C. This country has so many divisions, racial, religious, geographic, but at times like this it has a remarkable capacity to come together, and that's what's happening right now on the West Coast in the heartland of America. People feeling a great deal of sympathy with the people of New York and the people of Washington, D.C., and are in a state of complete shock. Never has America seen a day like this.
Nick, we're just going to take a look at the moment at some pictures that we've just got in from the scene in New York, just to bring us up to date with what's happening there. And people in your part of the country will be looking at these as well. The smoke and the dust seem to have settled, but now a major recovery operation will be taking place. Apparently we understand that there may be still some people alive in the wreckage of the World Trade Center and neighboring buildings, but people in Portland will just feel helpless.
Bill, we're hearing reports actually of people in the basement of the World Trade Center making cell phone calls to relatives as far away as Pennsylvania, saying where they are, saying that they're with New York police officers who are still alive, describing exactly where they are so that it will help the rescue effort. So that's the sort of thing that we're hearing coming out of New York. And of course this is a shared national experience which has caused disruption all over the United States. I started off the morning in Seattle there. The highest skyscraper in the city was closed down. The famous Sky Needle, very famous on Seattle's skyline, that was shut straight away. The federal buildings closed immediately. I'm dressed very scruffily. I tried to go to the shops to buy a shirt and a tie to come on TV tonight. I couldn't. The shops are shut. I've been trying to call New York, trying to call Washington. We can't. The phone lines are down. Britain's been trying to call the east coast of the United States. It can't. Again, the phone lines are down. It's caused disruption all over the United States. People here are stranded. All the airports are shut, and we're not quite sure when they're going to reopen.
Yes, we've just been seeing pictures, in fact, of Midtown Manhattan, which should normally be bustling with people, particularly Times Square, normally absolutely crowded with people, and it was virtually deserted, and lots of stores closed there, of course. President Bush has spoken to the nation a couple of hours ago. Do you think Americans will have taken comfort from his words?
I think they will have, and I think they're right behind him right now. We saw that remarkable bipartisan show on Capitol Hill earlier. Members of the Senate, members of the House of Representatives spilling onto the steps of Capitol Hill, expressing their support for the president, and then joining in a spontaneous rendition of God Bless America. Many people were moved by that. We've also had some instant polling conducted by a number of news organizations over here. The question, do you believe George W. Bush when he says that America has the capacity to hunt down and exact revenge on the people responsible for this attack? 91% of the people polled said that America has that capacity and should go ahead and seek revenge.
Nick Bryant in Portland, Oregon. Thank you very much. Well, as Nick mentioned, President Bush has promised to find those responsible for the attacks and to bring them to justice. Bill Hayton now looks at his options.
The wreckage at the Pentagon is still being cleared and the human cost still being counted. The horror inflicted on bases and embassies around the world over the past 2 decades has now hit America's highest military headquarters. The sheer might controlled from this building has made direct military attacks against the United States all but impossible. Instead, its enemies have turned to so-called asymmetric warfare, small-scale operations with dramatic effects, such as last year's bomb attack in Yemen against the USS Cole.
And I think it's got something to do with the fact that America continues to have their forces in the Middle East. America continues to back tyrant regimes. And I think that this should be a lesson not only for the American regime, but also to the Muslims worldwide, to say that we need to have a different type of relationship.
Washington has responded with court action against those it believes responsible, but also with direct military retaliation.
And I have no intentions of discussing today what comes next, but make no mistake about it, your armed forces are ready.
When Osama bin Laden's group bombed the US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania 3 years ago, killing more than 220 people, the response was dramatic. More than 80 cruise missiles were fired at sites in Afghanistan and Sudan, allegedly connected to his organization. They killed 20 people, but missed bin Laden himself. The actual bombers were extradited to the US, and last May, 4 men were convicted in New York and sentenced to life in jail. But retaliation doesn't always hit the right targets. In 1986, after 2 American soldiers were blown up in a Berlin nightclub, US planes bombed Libya, though it was later suggested that Syrian agents had been responsible. And Washington is being sued for millions of dollars by a businessman whose Sudanese factory was destroyed by a cruise missile after it was wrongly linked to bin Laden.
If they reflect on these questions and if they look at the source of the resentment in the Arab world and Muslim world, I believe there wouldn't be any attack. But sending cruise missile, it wouldn't solve the problem. It will maybe fuel more problems to the American and to the whole international community.
The USS Enterprise is sailing to join another carrier group in the Gulf, projecting American power into the heart of the Middle East. But political leaders must now decide whether using that power makes further attacks more or less likely in the future. Bill Hayton, BBC News.
Well, with me here in the studio is our diplomatic correspondent, Mike Wooldridge. Mike, expressions of shock and sympathy from many nations around the world, most nations, but not from all. What next?
It will depend, I suppose, on whether the level of condemnation that we're hearing now, and it is across a very wide front. I mean, there are perhaps unlikely nations joining in the language that we're hearing about these particular attacks, whether that does translate itself into more of a concerted international effort to deal with the issue of terrorism. We've heard this sort of rhetoric, if you like, before, of course, after previous attacks on a lesser scale. The issue would be whether the nature of these particular attacks does bring about a global effort that actually then has some more concrete action about it that could deal with terrorism in the way of perhaps joint action between security agencies and so on. This is the sort of practical step forward that's been suggested by a number of countries that have always considered themselves to be in the forefront of the fight against terrorism, countries like Russia, countries like India and so on.
Yes, because we were reporting earlier that the Petronas Twin Towers in Kuala Lumpur, the tallest buildings in the world, were evacuated after some kind of bomb threat. So any country with a large building on its territory must feel particularly vulnerable now.
Well, absolutely. I mean, we have a world on edge now, don't we? And as I say, I think that the question will be whether in the short term, of course, there is to be any kind of retaliation, any kind of reprisals by the United States. Of course, there may well be a mood in favor of that within the country. Wasn't really, of course, clear from President Bush's address whether that might actually take place, though importantly he did talk about drawing no distinction between those involved in terrorism and those who host terrorists. Maybe we could read some clues into that. If there were to be retaliation of some kind, anything on the lines of what we saw in 1988, the cruise missile attacks against Afghanistan, the attack against Sudan after the embassy bombings in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, whether that might in fact turn out to be counterproductive for the United States, whether that might then undermine an attempt to get a more globally agreed approach. These, I think, will be the key issues in the coming days and weeks.
Because the problem surely is that from all these hijackings, any evidence linking them to any particular group will have been obliterated in the explosions, so any proof would only be circumstantial.
Precisely, and of course, to be able to mount this kind of orchestrated operation inevitably involves a very shadowy network anyway, to be able to put it into effect and, if you like, fool the world's intelligence agencies, as seems to have happened here. Inevitably, this is a very amorphous nebulous thing that we're dealing with here. It makes it all the more difficult, of course, even if there were to be a new strategy on terrorism that were to be agreed between a large number of the world's nations. Would it necessarily be any more effective in the long term? Very often these debates appear to be going in one direction, and of course they break down on the issue of those who say what you've actually got to address is the roots of terrorism as well as the mechanics.